Alright, welcome to our first lesson in a new unit on comma usage. In order to really understand comma usage, we need to kind of move backward a little bit and understand a few things about clauses and coordinating conjunctions. So we're going to kind of back it up a little bit before we get into actual comma usage. And we'll start out talking about what a clause is. So in order to get to where we need to go, let's begin by talking about coordinating conjunctions. A coordinating conjunction joins words or word groups that are used in the same way. These are pretty common words: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And the easy way to kind of remember that these coordinating conjunctions are important is by remembering the term fanboys. Again, if you look at fanboys, you'll see for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. This will be really important later on when we get to comma usage, about using coordinating conjunctions and commas together. So just file that in the back of your head somewhere, that fanboys stands for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, those coordinating conjunctions. So what is a clause? Well, that's one kind of a clause, but that's not the clause I'm talking about. What we're talking about are these kind of clauses, that a clause is a word group that contains a verb and its subject, and that is used as a sentence or part of a sentence. Although every clause contains a subject and a verb, not every clause expresses a complete thought. In other words, if it contains a subject, a verb, and expresses a complete thought, not only is it a clause, but it's also a sentence. So if it just contains a subject and a verb without a complete thought, well, then it's not a sentence, it's just a clause. Clauses that express a complete thought are called independent clauses. They can stand completely by themselves. In other words, an independent clause is a sentence. Clauses that do not express a complete thought are called subordinate clauses. In other words, they may contain a subject, they may contain a verb, but they don't express a complete thought, and therefore they're not a sentence, and that's what we would call a subordinate clause. Let me show you some examples. Here's the independent clause, the people left the building. All right, it's a sentence. We have a subject, people, we have a verb, left, we have a complete thought, the fact that they left the building. That's an independent clause. It could stand by itself as a sentence. Here we have a subordinate clause, when the fire alarm sounded. Right? We have a subject in there, the fire alarm. We have a verb, sounded, but it doesn't express a complete thought. When the fire alarm sounded, what? There's no complete idea here. That's a subordinate clause. Now, if we put the subordinate clause and the independent clause together, we're left with not only a complete thought, but a sentence. When the fire alarm sounded, the people left the building. Let's walk through some examples of these. Baseball is a game that generally depends on good eyesight as well as athletic skill. What I'd like you to do right now is take a look at this sentence and for a moment think about what is the independent clause here and what's the subordinate clause. Is there part of this sentence that could stand completely on its own as an independent clause, that it has a subject, a verb, and expresses a complete thought? And is there another part of this sentence where you may have a subject, you may have a verb, but you don't have a complete thought? I'll give you a moment to look at that and consider it. Which part is the independent clause and which part is the subordinate clause? Baseball is a game is the independent clause. Subject baseball is the verb. Baseball is a game. It expresses a complete thought. It's an independent clause. Like I said before, it could stand by itself as a sentence. The subordinate clause is that generally depends on good eyesight as well as athletic skill. There's a lot going on there, but there isn't a complete thought. When we put it together with the independent clause, we have a complete sentence. And notice in this case, you have the independent clause followed by the subordinate clause. When a team is on defense, the pitcher and the catcher cannot field the batted ball themselves. Again, which one is the independent clause and which part is the subordinate clause? Take a moment and look at it. The pitcher and the catcher cannot field the batted ball themselves is the independent clause. Again, we have a compound subject in the pitcher and the catcher, and we have a verb in cannot field. So we have an independent clause there. We have a subject, we have a verb, we have a complete thought. When a team is on defense, again, there's a subject and a verb in there, but there's no complete thought. So that's the subordinate clause. And unlike the previous example, notice in this example that the subordinate clause comes before the independent clause. In the last example, it came after it. Let's look at one last example. Sighted players who put on blindfolds and join in come away from a game with a new respect for the abilities of their visually impaired teammates. Now, take a moment and look at this one because it's very, very tricky. See if you can spot the independent clause and see if you can spot the subordinate clause. All right, in this case, the subordinate clause is actually inside of the independent clause. The independent clause is sighted players come away from a game with a new respect for the abilities of their visually impaired teammates. That's the independent clause. There's the subject, there's the verb, there's the complete thought. But within that is who put on blindfolds and join in. That's the subordinate clause. That, again, put on blindfolds and join in. We have a subject, we have a verb, we just don't have that complete thought. So in this case, unlike the two previous examples, in one example the subordinate clause followed the independent clause, in the other example the subordinate clause came before the independent clause, in this case the subordinate clause is actually in the middle of the independent clause. Now again, like I said earlier, why are we spending so much time talking about clauses? Well, we're going to build up to comma usage shortly, and for the future lessons you really need to understand independent clauses and subordinate clauses along with fanboys in order to understand proper comma usage. So in the coming lessons you'll see how we're kind of building upon these ideas, and we'll review some of them. Please drop me an email or come see me during Extra Help if you have any questions.